Hello there. So in this video, I'm going to share some aperture examples with you. Some different images taken with different aperture settings so you can see when you might want to use a small or mid or a large aperture for your photos, because changing the aperture that you use can give you a wide variety of looks in your images. So we don't want to use the same aperture values all the time. We do kind of want to mix it up a little bit as well. And hopefully this video will help you understand aperture a little better, when you might want to use different aperture values, and inspire you to pick up your camera, get out there and start shooting with different F numbers. So if you're new here, hi, my name's Audrey-Ann from Live Snap Love, where I teach you how to master your camera so you can beautifully capture the people and the moments that matter most. Now, if you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and be sure to subscribe so that you'll stay in the loop for future videos. But for now, let's dive into the video where we're going to look at different aperture examples. Now, before I get to that, I want to give a super quick recap on aperture, just for anyone who might be brand new to photography and is watching this video. So aperture is simply a hole in your camera lens that lets light reach the camera sensor to take an image. Now you can actually see the hole in this image here and the blades around it that open and close in order to make your aperture larger or smaller. Now we choose our aperture, in other words, the hole or the size of that hole, to determine how much light reaches the camera sensor, but we also choose it to get different looks to our images, because aperture also controls depth of field, which is really just a fancy way of saying how much or how little of our scene is in focus. If we use a large aperture, then we get less of the scene in focus. Whereas if we use a small aperture, we get more of the scene in focus. Now, it does seem like it should be the other way around, I know, and it will take a little while until it becomes second nature. But that's essentially how we choose our aperture, by how much light we want to let into the camera and to determine how much of the scene we want to be in focus. And we do that by choosing an F number. So you can choose something like f2.8, f5.6, or f14 or f22. So we have this whole range of apertures that we can choose, and we can choose different ones to get different looks to our images. Now, I have essentially gone over what is a very large subject in about 1 minute. And I do want you to know that there is so much more. In fact, we've got about 3 different lectures on aperture alone in our Auto to Awesome program. So there's a lot more to learn. You can also make a start today. We've got a free download for you, guide to shooting in aperture priority mode. You'll find it in the description underneath where you're watching this video. But for now, I want to move on to the whole point and purpose of this video, which is to show you some different images taken with different aperture ranges and when you might want to use them. So let's start by using a wide or large aperture. Now, a wide aperture is a F number of somewhere around f1.4 to around f4.0. Now, portraits are a classic example of when you might want to use a larger aperture, because they help give us that blurry background and our subject is in sharp focus, and that helps them just pop off the screen. So it really helps bring attention directly to our subject. Now, this particular image was shot at f2.8, and you can see that the background is super blurry, but my subject is in tack sharp focus, so they really do seem to pop off the background. Another example of a time when you might want to blur out the background is for documentaries, kind of lifestyle shots. And this is particularly useful when you're shooting indoors, for example, and you've got lots of clutter and background items competing for attention with our subject. So blurring out the background by using a smaller F number helps bring any mess or distractions blissfully under control so that it's not the first thing that you see in the photo. Now, in this example, I'm using f3.2, and although there's still a lot going on in the frame and several distracting elements, the aperture helps blur out all that clutter and it gets cleans basically up the frame without my having to lift a finger, which is the perfect way to clean your house. So if you are somewhere with messy or distracting background elements, again, consider using a larger aperture to blur out the background and bring attention squarely onto your subject. Now here is another example of a time when you might want to use a wider aperture, and that is to get light bokeh. In other words, that's circles of light that you see in the background, and you can see an example of it in this image here. Now you get this effect by having some points of light in the background. In this example, I'm using just fairy light strung over a chair, but any kind of points of light in the background will give you this effect. And then again, you use that smaller f number to get the wider aperture, and that will blur the light to create circles. And that's just a fun little trick to add a little bit of extra interest to an image. Now let's move on to some examples of when you might want to use a mid-range aperture setting. Now for mid-range, I mean somewhere of around f5.6 to around f11. Now, generally speaking, I only find myself using aperture numbers of this range in group or family photos. And that's because we want to have a large enough depth of field in order to get everyone in the frame in focus. So we can often find ourselves needing to use a slightly smaller aperture to get a wider depth of field than we do with the, shooting with that wider range of apertures. Now, the reason I try to shy away from these most of the time is that they give a certain snapshotty look to your image. And that's because if you're shooting on auto, your camera will frequently choose a middle of the road aperture setting. And that's because it doesn't have a freaking clue what image you're trying to take. So it kind of goes for a middle of the road. It kind of catch all aperture setting. And that tends to be f5.6, f8 or f11. So taking images with that mid-range aperture setting can sometimes give you that snapshot effect. Now, that's not to say that you will never use these kind of numbers, or if you do, your photos won't look good. There will always be times when a general rule doesn't fit. And that's also why it's really important to truly learn about aperture and not just read random tutorials on it. Now, for example, you might find yourself using f5.6 for a single portrait, or f11 when you're shooting a more macro style shot. So definitely we use these aperture numbers for other things. But again, just be careful when using it that you have a purpose for doing it and you're not using it in order to kind of catch everything because you're not sure which right aperture to use. So let's scoot on over now to some small aperture examples. So the aperture range you're looking at here, which is a small aperture, is f13 to f22 or f32, depending on the smallest aperture of your lens. Now, as you know, shooting with a small aperture gives you a wider depth of field, in other words, more of the area in focus. And a classic reason why you might want to use this is when you're shooting landscapes, when you generally want everything from near to far to be in focus. You can also use this for more environmental type portraits. For example, you're photographing your child at the beach and you want to capture the environment there as well and not have that blurred into submission by using a large aperture. So that's two main reasons why you might want to use a smaller aperture to get that larger area in focus. Another thing you might want to do is create starbursts. Now this is when you take any points of light in your image and instead of making them into circles like we did earlier, we make them into stars like this image you can see on the screen. Now you can do this with any light sources, but one we will always have available is the sun. So all you need to do is point your camera in the direction of the sun and use that smaller aperture, use that larger f number and take your photo and the sun will turn into that burst of light. Now, absolutely huge, very important caveat here. You must not look at the sun directly through your viewfinder. If you do so, you will hurt your eyes and you can damage them irreparably. So please don't do that. Just kind of wave your camera in the general direction rather than looking through the viewfinder at the sun. So now I'd like to put this over to you because I really want to encourage you to get out there and start practicing with different aperture numbers. So make sure you're using aperture priority mode. Now, if you are not using this already or you just want some help with it, be sure to download that free aperture priority mode cheat sheet. You'll find a link to it underneath this video in the description, and that's going to help you out. Then I want you to start practicing using different F numbers. In fact, I want to challenge you to take an image using a large aperture, that small F number, one with a mid-range aperture, and then one with a really small aperture. Think about when you might want to use each one and start experimenting. It's a great way to learn about aperture and just to help you get more variety in your portfolio. So that's it from me for this week. Again, please be sure to subscribe, and that way you will stay in the loop for future videos, and I will see you again next week. Bye for now.